Good.
Yuka, thank you very much for the introduction and welcome, everybody. As Yuka mentioned, we will try to hold the lecture through the slides, and then this format doesn't allow for you to speak your questions, unfortunately, but we will try to read them and talk about them that way at the end. I need to acknowledge, some of you can already see it in the chat, the variety of time zones and climates and cultures that people are logging in from. We have lost a huge amount in this pandemic, but maybe the one thing that we have gained is the ease with which things like a lecture can be spread out a little bit more. So I think the losses list is a little bit longer than the gains list, but I am holding very tight to the few things that we can celebrate as gains, which is why this announcement was spread as far as it was. So welcome from all corners and time zones. The recording will be made available afterwards. If you have colleagues or friends who were not available, we're probably not going to make it public, but we'll make it a link if you'd like to contact us and share it with someone else afterwards. Without further ado, I will do my technical dance of sharing my screen. Just a second. I don't know why the brain struggles with typing and speaking at the same time. Are we okay, Yuka?
Yes, we are just fine.
Yes, okay. The slides that I have put together for this afternoon had an earlier life, a talk that I gave nearly a year ago at a museum in Falkenberg in Sweden called Rian. That was first a group of Nordic curators who were gathering to talk about the identity of craft. And I had suggested that my position was hardly an expert on the Nordic region, but maybe a comparative exercise with other types of craft that occur around the world. That then morphed into a piece of writing that some of you might have seen in the lecture invitation, which was very much a summary. And for this afternoon, I have had to take stock of the year since I thought about those things, a year that has involved no travel, which for me and probably for many of you has been a lifeblood in my own life. So remarkable to even think that a year has passed with really no movement, no geographic movement, a lot of digital movement. And it has made me understand people's practices a little bit differently. So this is a combination of some reflection on what some practices might mean now that they might not have meant when they were first made. And this idea of meaning or meaningfulness, you will hear in the end, is, I must admit, an adaptation of a project by an Australian jeweler, Susan Cohn, whose project Meaninglessness was a response to Danish immigration law that she made a project about. So meaningful is not to suggest that there aren't many other types of meaningful craft practices, but is playing on the title of her project. And those questions about immigration law, which I find now also have a huge amount of relevance when we live in this pandemic environment that we are in as well. I'll come back to this artist a little bit later on, but Vincent is based in Bandung in Indonesia, and I met him just before travel ended last year. And although this is photography, and some of you might be wondering why I'm showing you photography at the beginning of a craft lecture, one of the things that I think is fascinating is the way that craft practices inform other ways of working and ways of making. I'll return to that a little bit later. As I said at the beginning, I have needed to revisit work that I had the opportunity to look at physically and try to understand what it means now. Part of my interest in looking at craft globally, and we're looking now at an image of a building in Detroit in the US, but part of my interest in trying to situate my interests beyond the local is a sense of responsibility for remembering how big the world is. And I think we all maybe feel like we're living in very difficult circumstances. Sometimes Swedish students that I work with in particular talk about the privilege of their situation or the privilege of a Northern European life and home, and struggle with what might be done with that, how to navigate that. And my only suggestion is that we all take enormous responsibility for teaching ourselves and remembering how big the world is. Doesn't necessarily mean we need to apologize from where we speak from, but I think we do have a responsibility to understand the variety of contexts that people live and work in. And I have a particular interest in trying to remember that craft's identity is that big, and it changes a lot across different contexts. And that can be complicated, but I think it's also fascinating. So rather than see that as a contradiction or a frustration, I try to think that those extremes are something that maybe we're all responsible for remembering. So this was one of the first projects that I started, frankly, to really struggle with as far as what it might mean today compared to when I encountered it or when I even thought about it a year ago. This is a building that is owned by a Danish artist, a ceramicist who is based in the US. And it is both a studio, a residency, a project space. The unusual color of blue that it is painted with is a reference to the police station down the street, which also uses that blue, and a symbolic request for protection. This is not, or has not been, a particularly safe part of Detroit. Detroit is a very, very divided, racially divided, economically divided, socioeconomically divided city. So these are things that an image doesn't give much of a sense of. The project title as well is interesting because it's an address that doesn't exist anymore through rezoning. So if you use the inevitable GPS to visit, it's almost as though you're visiting a place of erasure or a place of denial. There's a piece of installation art in this building that was possible to view by appointment. So I mentioned to you at the beginning of this that our list of losses, as far as I'm concerned, is longer than our list of gains in the pandemic. A lot of people joining an online lecture is certainly a gain that I think we all learn. Something like making appointments to visit installation art on trips that I unfortunately very much took for granted a few years ago is a huge hole, at least in my life. You would make an appointment, and as an individual or as a very small group of people, not a large group, only one or two people, be met by an attendant at the gate and invited with very little sort of setup or explanation for what you were about to see into the artist's installation, through the police blue and inside to an environment which has aspects to it that are impossible to access through this screen with you now. A scent of candles throughout. I visited in the winter, so it was dark. The interior are these charred wood walls, which you could still smell the scent of burnt wood, and these very sort of heavy waxy candles. But of course, some of the things that I've thought about reflecting on a work like this is what has happened in the US in the year in between, the violence surrounding the latest election results, the increasing energy behind the Black Lives Matter movement, which has moved around the world, and practically not specifically to the US or Detroit at all, but many of our own experiences of claustrophobia, living in lockdown, and the idea of an enclosed interior and its fascination and its beauty may be resonating very differently for us now. Small aspects of the installation are also intentionally off kilter. So that image on the left is not a sloppy photographer. You know, it's a room that's built intentionally built off of 90 degrees. I think that the best that we can do is talk and share with each other these experiences, because I recognize that showing you images of something that was such a visceral experience is incredibly hard to access. And it's a big question that I have for craft for tomorrow, for the future, and craft as it exists in our lockdown environment. The fact that we can move and share things online is certainly better than nothing. But so many of the sensations that motivate us to work across a range of craft materials, Yuka mentioned that my heart is very much with textiles, but across a range, are absolutely lost on the screen. And I think we constantly have to remind ourselves of that as well, so that we don't accept that what we are looking at is actually the full experience. So that, I must admit, was a rather bleak start. An environment that is much harder to access now, an environment that is probably accruing very different associations than when it was initially made. That's not necessarily negative, but politically activates things in quite different ways. And also a project that, although it is exquisitely photographed, is limited if we can't travel and access it. Here's maybe an inversion of that example, which I had to recognize. An exhibition in South Africa, in Cape Town, which I reviewed from a distance. That's not necessarily a conventional way to look at things, but the exhibition was only online as the gallery closed during COVID. And I had to think about other materials differently. Stained glass is experienced, I was going to say activated, through the light moving through the back of the material, the same backlighting that we're looking at through a computer screen now. So I wouldn't necessarily say that this is the type of work that I often write about or that I even know how to access, but there seemed to be a different type of permission and interest granted if I can only visit an exhibition online and it happens to be using a material that is not so dissimilar to our experience of looking at something through a computer screen, then that starts to have a type of movement in this digital world that maybe something else like ceramic or textile suffers with a bit more. There are, of course, other limitations. I know from the artist's statement that the intention here was that as we stood in front of these large narrative panels, the light would also fall on our bodies. So involve us in the work, implicate us in the work, which are conventional portraits, but conventional portraits of identities that are not conventionally recorded and circulated. But materially, I think these questions are really interesting to think about for the future. I'm not encouraging that we start to think of craft decisions and material decisions based on what travels through our computer screens. I'm not advocating that people make those types of strategic decisions, but some practices have some luck behind them at the moment. And the back screen light of our computers and the stained glass is possibly one of them. So those are sort of two extremes, the things that I think become so much harder to access and the things that have a strange added benefit at the moment as we do everything online. I had to also start to think about what we expect of craft and what it is burdened with. Meaningful or meaninglessness, as I suggested at the beginning. I think that we're living in a time where if there is any possibility of dreaming or keeping our imaginations alive, I think some of us at least are finding that to be an incredible comfort. And that's not anything new. Many people have lived through many different types of circumstances that have asked for the imagination to see them through things that in their immediate moment are incredibly difficult. This is a quilt, a painted and pieced quilt by the African-American artist Faith Ringgold, which is also used on the cover of a book that she wrote. The top of the quilt, midsection, you see a illuminated bridge, the George Washington Bridge in New York. And the narrator talks about that bridge being her diamond necklace. You can fly in the sky, and this is something that you can own and enjoy and love every single night. And those sorts of feats of imagination, I think, are more and more important for all of our sanity at the moment. But Ringgold has a really interesting backstory to how she came to work with the textile. It's not the nicest story. It's a story brought about of negative expectations and problems. But I think if we're going to be realistic about how people arrive at craft practices and what they mean, and we can be more accurate then about what they offer, hers is a curious one. She talks in an interview piece with the artistic director of the Serpentine Galleries in London of a book that she wrote, which was rejected by the publisher after she had felt that she had completed the manuscript. And as an African-American woman, she felt that she had written an accurate life story that was not acceptable to the publishing world because it wasn't negative enough. She didn't have enough horror to disclose, a slightly prurient idea of wanting to hear of a life of trouble. And any of you who've seen Ringgold live or talk online, this is up on YouTube for those of you that are interested. She is a very, very passionate and dynamic speaker. And she said, I'm sorry, my life hadn't been a horror. I hadn't gotten raped or thrown out a window or beaten up. My biography didn't contain all of this drama that the publisher possibly had wanted. She then goes on to suggest at least in the past, was there a time that African-American women's writing almost had to trade in this type of negativity, to this type of disclosure. She said that wasn't her story. She wasn't going to make up a violence that she hadn't experienced. She wanted to tell her own story, and rather beautifully, for a textile person, she turned to the textile. She decided to tell her story on cloth if it was not going to be of interest to the publishing world. So I think that leaves us sort of with some really interesting, exciting ideas about what material narration and what material communication can offer us when other types of conventions shut us down. She believed she was being censored. And she believed that she was being asked to explain an experience which was not true. And she found a freedom instead on cloth, making eventually some highly, highly political works such as these here. She certainly didn't shy from dramatic or political content, but she wanted to be able to say it in her voice, not please another industry. Sometimes craft does struggle for where its place is or how it can be heard. And I think some of these stories are incredibly powerful to recognize that for her, the quilt and the textile became a place of freedom. But here we come to this other problem. So a place of freedom, yes, a place where maybe we can communicate in ways that are not always welcome in other disciplines or other places. But I cannot deny that the textile and craft materials more broadly can also really struggle for recognition in a broader context. Financial recognition, we do have to say this, financial recognition, and then with financial recognition, other types of respect in a broader art context. And this is where I feel that sometimes the differences between different parts of the world become very acute. This is a conversation I had with a curator also in Indonesia early last year. And I think that at least in Northern European discourse, there is a sense that when we do things slowly and we work by hand, we work with communities that see real value in that as a pushback against commercialization and the speed of things, and also a recognition of other types of values. But there are vast populations of the world where making things by hand is not unusual. And so to assume that something, just because it's made by hand, immediately creates a value in the eyes of a local community, it's particular to certain contexts. It's not at all a global system. And so I just found this warning to be so sage, to remember in economies where labor is cheap, is already cheap, and we may feel that some of our skills aren't properly valued, but if you take them across an entire global context, we have to acknowledge the vast discrepancies in labor wages. So in economies where labor is cheap, making things slowly by hand is not valuable. Quality of work continues to decrease because there is a lack of appreciation from our society, he's referring to Indonesia, towards so-called folk or traditional handicraft. And then it becomes a kind of vicious circle. These references to folk and traditional handicraft, I'll pick up in some later slides as well, because I think I probably have in the past tried to make it clear to people, oh no, I don't mean that. I'm a professor of craft. I don't mean traditional handicraft. But more recently, I've started to wonder why even I sort of get so nervous about those things being mixed up. The hobbyist, the folk, the traditional, they are all part of a very large identity of craft. They mean many different things in different contexts. And this is, as I said at the beginning, where it gets potentially incredibly confusing, but maybe that also should be considered something that's interesting and exciting rather than just problematic miscommunication. So here we have a Dutch artist who is very much tapping into this idea of labor and value and a lack of value connected to labor. And he's using it in a very astute way to set different value systems against each other. You're looking at the artist with a block of indigo, natural indigo, which is used actually to dye my shirt, maybe to dye Yuka's shirt, a deep blue, which is a difficult way to dye. And in some places, a tradition which is knowledge is being lost. So Vincent Voelsma is the type of artist who is very interested in connecting with others and showing that the production of his work doesn't occur in a silo. He doesn't actually want to learn all of the different things that would be needed to work alone. He wants to use his studio absolutely to connect and work with others. So acknowledging his dependence on other people for the materialization of the work, a reality that is repressed in contemporary life. So there are many artistic practices, I won't name and shame them here, but they're not made by the artists' names we know. And that's a trade secret. You know, that's not necessarily a priority. That becomes a little bit more complex in craft practices, but through many different things in our object world, we don't know much about how they're materialized, and it's not something that people worry about. He wanted to really expose this. So he was able to make a number of trips to India, the subcontinent of India, and traveled to indigo plantations, learnt about the incredible labor around this. And Return is a project that he came up with, which was very much looking at how to try to materialize, acknowledge, and also connect work with the people that worked on the indigo plantations. Not necessarily so dissimilar from Dan Holter, for the horticulture students that might have heard that talk last year, a Zimbabwean who also very much searches for connections to other material knowledge as a premise of his practice. So here are these extraordinary blocks that Wulfsma commissions from the plantations, the indigo plantations. And the way this is meant to shed light on the economics of the art world that we're all in different ways trapped in is that if he is approached by a museum or a gallery to exhibit one of those blocks, he is able to use his artist's fee for that exhibition to commission the indigo workers to make a new block. It's slow. It takes time to produce this. And one of the commitments that Vincent Wulfsma has made is that those blocks don't recirculate in the art world. And by that, I mean, if you saw one in an exhibition this month, a different opportunity triggers a new commission to the people that are producing the indigo. And that new commission triggers a new payment. So that there's an effort to keep that movement rather than simply extract one and then circulate it in the closed loop of the art world. So this desire to pause goes against our attraction for speed. I suppose many of our material practices do that, but also this idea that to be successful requires a high amount of movement of our writing or of our artistic outputs. But he wants instead to slow that down and say, no, if this is of value to this public venue, it needs to trigger and also accommodate the time schedule of this much slower way of making. This is another component of that project. Laser cuts into a historic piece of cloth. If you could try to imagine the conventional global map, you have this is looking at the Atlantic Ocean and the trade of enslaved people and the trade of cotton, often which occurred on the same ships. Enslaved peoples moving from east to west, and those same ships carrying the labors of their work, the cotton back to Europe for manufacturing. So as I said, something that really sort of tries to go against the speed of moving objects around the world. And this project was also very much based on the records of a Dutch trading company who was moving these objects. And the textile, unfortunately, along with tea, coffee, sugar, spices, people, indigo, textiles were a huge part of this trade movement. There's a huge history of cotton written by a historian called Sven Beckert, and he reminds us that it was the trade of people that also moved cotton, their labor and their work, and then their trade back to Europe. So these are all different practices that are trying to use materials to activate something that is very local and very global at the same time. And I said at the beginning that I suppose is where my interest lies. I have a fascination that roams and moves around the world. But that's not to say it's because I think that things can be flattened or that it's that easy to talk about generalizations. So a lot of these projects are also quite sort of acute in their specific locations. Pastor Abad was a Filipino-American artist. And this work, the village where I came from, was based on her early childhood in the Philippines, and part of an exhibition in Bristol at Spike Island last year. The tree that is in enormous blossom in this picture, a blossom that might arrive some spring for us. If you can see in the detail, it's made out of buttons. She worked across a range of materials, and one of the things that was interesting about the Spike Island installation is to the far right. I've put in a very small image, but a lot of these very large quilts were shown in a way that you could access the backs and see the stitching and the construction as well. One of the exhibition was curated by Abad's cousin, who is an artist in his own right, but has also been doing extensive work to provide access to his aunt's archive, which had not, until this exhibition, had a lot of documentation associated with it. She passed away about 25 years ago, and maybe was an artist very, very before her times. One of the things that Pio Abad has worked on is photographic documentation to try and provide researchers with more access to this extraordinary artist's work. So that's a tough lesson. The reality is that that we do move our craft practices around the world through images, and without that type of documentation, a lot of experiences and a lot of efforts do get written over by history. One of the things that is also interesting about this particular person is a shift in the art world that occurred after she passed away, which is really unlucky as far as a broader global understanding of her career. She spent quite a lot of time living in the US and then traveled and lived in a massive number of countries. And a lot of the work that she made was very particular to each of the locations that she lived in, whether it was batik or trapunto or different embroidery techniques that she learnt in the different places that she lived. But I think that we also need to try to watch for things like this that maybe were underappreciated during the time in which they were made. So one of the things that her cousin has recognized is the number of opportunities for art to circulate globally that emerged after his aunt had passed away. So she often exhibited in communities of the global South, and the global South is something that we speak about now, but is a sort of a relatively recent attention from the art world. So things like the triennials in Japan, the Asian art show, the Havana Biennial in Cuba, or something like the Hong Kong Art Fair, which until all art fairs met the problems of the recent pandemic, would have meant that a much broader range of artists were in circulation. Many of these things weren't acknowledged, at least by mainstream media, at the time that this artwork was in circulation. I think we really need to be cautious of that at the moment, when we're living so much online and nobody is traveling and nobody is meeting new people, to be aware of how controlled our information is through certain types of outlets. And if it isn't recognized in a certain venue, then somehow silence sits around a whole entire practice, unless we possibly are more vocal about the practitioners and the people that we know who possibly deserve to reach broader audiences and do some of that work ourselves, rather than allowing journalism to dictate what art might really be of value. Anthony Bumhira was a Zimbabwean artist who passed away in early 2020 at a young age. I spoke with him at a panel the year before, and he had a really interesting lesson to offer about what he sort of referred to as two names, two ways of practicing, two types of artwork. What you're looking at here is a large work that is made with wooden clothes pegs, the wooden clothes pegs that almost start to look like little doll figures, which he has wrapped individually in cloth and a crochet, so a very large bed-sized piece of work. Crochet is something that would have been traded for economic value, particularly between Zimbabwe and South Africa during the sanctions era in particular. I think the detail makes it clearer. So you can see the number of people, the number of identities that comprise the work. In this piece, Houses for All, he talks about the empty promises that Mugabe's regime in Zimbabwe provided, that there would be accommodation, that there would be livelihoods and homes for all. Zimbabwe is a country that has been in economic freefall and political turbulence for many years now. And so projects like this try to find a way to make political commentary in contexts where censorship is very much alive. And I think that this is another warning I would try to offer when we think about craft and what it can communicate and what it can communicate globally, that probably most of us online today are living in places of quite extensive freedom when it comes to what we can say, and don't live under overt censorship. We might have problems of personal censorship of our own, or our own confidence or concern about value, but that's really different from regimes of overt political oppression, and they're not of the past. I think that is a problem, that we sometimes allow history to speak to these things, and we understand the problems of the past and maybe aren't quite so accurate in acknowledging how present many of these challenges are. One of the questions that this artist was faced with, or challenged with when we spoke in Cape Town, was the opportunity for livelihood for Zimbabwean artists, and then people working, for instance, with textile materials. Those are the little clothes peg people. And this is the answer that he provided. And it made me realize that this is something maybe of an open secret in the arts that we might all benefit from thinking about. Not only a far more extreme economic challenge, such as livelihood in Zimbabwe, but he was asked, how are artists in Zimbabwe supporting themselves financially? This is not a place even pre-COVID where there would have been recent tourism. There was a tourism industry of the past. These things have become only much, much more acute as the world has locked down and there is no travel. And for many contexts also very difficult systems of transport. So even if there was a collector outside the country, problems with the ability for a postal service or a delivery service to move things make everything a massive challenge. So his response was, I do two styles, one for commercial and one for the galleries, serious galleries. And by this, he is sort of alluding to some type of legitimate fine art world. I do small artworks for curio shops in Zimbabwe. I'm privileged because I used to sell a lot, but this is a style that he is abandoning. And then the same person asks, so but what about your signature? Does this curio work and the fine art work come under the same name? And he says no, he has a double identity and acknowledges that he was taught this as a strategy by one of the most long-standing galleries in Zimbabwe, Gallery Delta. And I have thought so much about this, this answer, because I think that it is something that we deny ourselves as an option, or almost feel that lacks a type of authenticity as an artist. And throughout history, there have been countless examples of multiple identities enacted by a single creative practice. This is a real aspect of craft in a global context. These two identities, these potentially two names or three names or four names. It might not represent curio art, tourist art, the things that are sold in airports, if anyone ever goes to an airport again. That might not be what we are thinking about when we talk about craft. Certainly at Haute in Gothenburg, that's not what we mean when we use the word. But I do want us to recognize that it is part of a global system, and understanding our relationship to it, and at a minimum, what some practices in some parts of the world do to navigate that, I think is part of our responsibility as people who study and research and educate in the crafts. To say that that is nothing to do with us is going to make that space bigger, rather than acknowledging that it might not be how I work, because I have a different context that I work in, but that is also a huge part of the community that I am part of. Because here's another warning. Tintin Vulia was a postdoctoral student, postdoctoral fellow, I should say, at Haute, and is now, when the pandemic allows, returning as a researcher on a VR project with us. And before I traveled to Indonesia, she is from Indonesia herself, and she reminded me of this warning. Public funding, and I think we're using the word Indonesia here, but this goes for so many different global contexts, does not mean a government scheme or artistic development fund given through a national arts organization. It will mean something that a community can do locally, crowdsourcing or local fund generation. And if there are anxieties about the privileged position that some of the Nordic researchers and students sit in, I think it's our responsibility to recognize these types of realities, and also maybe sometimes to learn from them, because there is a huge amount of drive and commitment that often comes from situations where there's an absence of government infrastructure to support the arts. Solutions must be sought in other places. I'm not saying that that's positive, but it is incredibly inspiring to see how artists and practitioners can navigate that in different ways. It doesn't mean that creative practice doesn't exist at all. I wonder if sometimes it means that there's a different type of health and vibrancy. This is the artist that I showed you in the opening slide of the talk. The posters of portraits that were temporarily glued in a public space. So Vincent has studied ceramics at the Institute of Technology in Bandung, and acknowledges that I trained myself to produce art not because of the exhibition, not necessarily because of the champagne and the fame and the opening that none of us can get to now anyway, but because we need to produce art, because we need to be creative, because it's a type of logic and lifeblood that is something that we need to exist. And so I show you this this practice because I think it's a really interesting example of a transfer of craft knowledge into really different material ways of working, but underpinned by a logic that I think some of you can have a real sympathy to. So ceramic was his way of working, but he worked with small, pinched, very slow to hand build pieces of work that were very, very large as a student, a way of producing that was not possible for him outside of his studies. So a large ceramic studio working with that volume of material wasn't going to be possible to continue. Instead, he tapped into what that type of practice had taught him. Discipline and patience and repetition, and the value of repetition over and over and over again, that doesn't have to be mundane, that can be an enormous way to connect with people and to possibly access other things. So he has ongoing projects. The portraits was what I showed you earlier. This is Moving Museum. Moving Museum was based on the idea that museums can be places of enormous exclusion, not necessarily inviting to a whole population, not places that feel comfortable or necessarily physically accessible. But the idea of valuing objects and objects telling stories, and those stories being stories that are useful and enjoyable and pleasurable for a community to share, if that's what a museum is, then we can involve a much broader group of people. So his Moving Museum asked for temporary donations from the community of objects. And with volunteers, he built these temporary spaces, and the objects were displayed in a way that was publicly much more welcoming necessarily than the conventions of a stuffy urban museum might be. The idea of the loan was about trust, and Vincent's, got two Vincents here. Vincent's projects often hinge around trust. His use of time to invest in a community and in return very slowly build trust. So maybe like Vincent Volsma, also believing that you need to develop something with a community over time. So the Indigo project, that wasn't something that was done once and pulled away from a group. In the same way, these projects return again and again. I really want to hear your life story. I want to know about these objects. And I don't want to purchase or trade these objects for you. I want you to trust me enough that you will loan them and that they will then be returned. And that is also part of embedding a project in a community, rather than swooping in, collecting something for your own good and never being seen again. So these are some of the objects that he collected. You can imagine the amount of local stories that would survive around them, and the idea of local relevance. So if something helicoptered into a community that doesn't have any roots, doesn't have any connection, then that can be a very alienating way to reach communication with people. The portraits image that I showed you at the beginning is also based totally on trust. And it's an idea that there are many people who don't believe that their portrait is something worthwhile, or that they haven't, the idea of being recognized in some way isn't something they've experienced in their lives before. But the way that this artist goes about these projects is through multiple repeat visits to families and homes, so that there is a sense of trust building up. The portraits are printed often on inexpensive paper, and the point is that they are also given to the subject. And this is crucial in contexts, particularly political contexts that have experienced a lot of journalists and journalists who have arrived sometimes to record trauma, such as past famines in Ethiopia. And the community has already experienced a sense of grab and leave. So you take something from me, and an image of my face that I never see, I don't know what it's used for. And instead turn that back to the community. So the moving museum and the portraits is about spending enough time with a local community to figure out what they would want, rather than imposing and sort of an exterior view on what a practitioner thinks a community might want. And that repetition started with hand building ceramics. Don't panic, those of you that are itching for a cup of tea or are getting screen glare, which we've all experienced. We're closing in on it. Don't worry. My monologue is nearly wrapping up. I called this lecture Meaningful Craft, and that's not to dismiss a million other types of practices, including ones that are highly aesthetic in their intentions, as not having meaning. I think that is also very meaningful. But I told you at the beginning, what I was playing on was this Australian artist, Susan Cohn, and her meaninglessness project. Yuka and I actually were lucky enough to see one of these performances. It traveled across Denmark, also Australia, and as a portion of the performance, she brings out her jewelry maker's tools and is making as she offers this dialogue about the value of objects and what they communicate, and about her questions around national decisions in Australia and Denmark surrounding immigration policy. So there were many events throughout Denmark, and the reason why Cohen traveled to Denmark was that the two countries have pursued a similar approach to immigration policy, and Cohen makes it really clear that she is not actively criticizing Denmark. She's an Australian concerned with Australia, and Denmark has taken inspiration for some of its particularly aggressive immigration policy from Australia. So this is a case of trying to understand two problematic contexts rather than swooping in and saying, here I go, here are my critique of another culture. But Denmark had a policy. It wasn't a fantastic success, thank God, but requiring assets of over 2,000 Australian dollars, including meaningless jewelry. And this is where the project starts. What in the world is meaningless jewelry? Because it's certainly not necessarily correlated to economic value. We have no idea what values things hold for us. But they tried to have a policy where meaningless jewelry was to be confiscated to subsidize the upkeep of people seeking asylum in Denmark. And so Cohen produced a lecture performance about the fact that Denmark had drawn some of its ideas from particularly aggressive immigration policy in Australia, about the question of how we could possibly define what meaningless jewelry is. And I have to say about some very human interaction she found when she realized that she could not find a single immigration officer who had actually tried to enact this policy. There wasn't a person who wanted to go so far as to determine what meaningful or meaningless was, whether it was a ribbon around somebody's finger or something of conventional value. So it isn't only a story of horror. It is very much also about the fact that when policy arrives that is abhorrent, on some level you can find humans who are not willing to enact that. So these are some of the questions that Cohen asked of that particular moment in time, which is a couple of years ago now, but I found them to be so pertinent to the context that we live in now in the pandemic. And everyone who has logged on today is living probably under very different guidelines, regulations, instructions, even the language we might want to use. Some of us have choice about our movement. Some of us don't have any choice at all. Some of us are locked down totally. Some of us have not ever been locked down, but have been given guidance or advice. And many of the things that she asks seem to have carried over into this year in a very, very strong way. So regarding immigration, she is asking, how do I stand up for something that I believe in? How do I find the courage to do this? How do I trust somebody that I don't know? She's talking about being a more engaged citizen, taking responsibility for a community. She's based in Melbourne in Australia. Melbourne has had some of the toughest pandemic lockdowns in the beginning of this. They're not under those restrictions now, but there was also a huge amount of community activity that was needed in some of their toughest lockdown periods, because movement really was absolutely curtailed. And then with regards to immigration, some of you might need to apply this to the pandemic as well, but with regards to immigration, she said, what do you do when you're living under a government whose values are hostile to your own? So she was talking about how do we reach out to other people? How do we extend our interest and care and connect and pull back from policy that for cultural or national reasons we might be associated with, but we don't agree with, and we want to make that clear to others. As part of that performance that I showed you, she made pins of the 4-leaf clover, and gift giving was also central to this exercise. And so as a participant observer, we could say, in the audience, each person was offered a gift of her making during the performance. And they were given with instructions. So there's the silver pin, the 4th leaf of the 4-leaf clover, often considered luck in many cultures, but a request. And a request which was about community building then, which seems to be so timely for the world that we live in today. Things like giving the gift on, passing it on to somebody else, or listening rather than speaking. Looking into the eyes of someone might be a little hard for us in lockdown at the moment, but to feel optimism or kindness. And she's a practical woman. Down at the bottom, sell it and give the money to someone in need. Start a conversation with a stranger. It seems as though the moment that first triggered her to make these things is absolutely the moment that we are still completely alive in now. And these are the opportunities that I think craft making very, very much offers us as well, particularly if we keep a mind out for the fact that we are all responsible for local understanding. But if that local understanding can be situated in something that remembers how vast the discrepancies are that we live in globally, that might also help us to appreciate a little bit more some of the places that we do work from. So without further ado, I will end the screen share, which I think will allow us to see some of the questions. We do have a little bit of time for questions. And I can also now, as people possibly need to dash off or stretch their legs, say if anyone got stuck with something and needs to leave, you're very welcome just to drop me an email and say, I missed that artist's name, or what was that reference. I'm happy to deal with things that way as well.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for the lecture, and also really pinpointing and calibrating this lecture after the first year of the COVID experience, which I heard the similar lecture last year together with you at the Ryan Museum, and then the repercussion, readjustment due to the current COVID, that has been really being aware how and pinpoint how craft is really good at telling criticality because of life stories, because we are using everyday objects that extract and narrate. So we feel the immediacy, and also like often in education, we feel is this craft is also critical, like of having its own position in education. Is it academic, non-academic? Because it's media based, right? So like, why do you limit your media when your idea has somewhere else? Why do you limit it? So I think it's very exciting to hear the necessity of spending time instead of executing it in a painting. Why do you execute it in embroidery? Because it already is a statement that you have spent time, and the time was available in order to do what. So this was really convincing and exciting to see the different being put in also different context between back then and now of your lecture. We have several questions in the chat, and I would like to also welcome the audience to type in your questions, either in the chat or in the Q&A boxes if you hit the bottom box. The first question is, what is the name of the author of the trade slavery book?
Sven Beckett, but the book title is Cotton, and the subtitle is something like A History of da-da-da-da-da. But the first part of the title is simply Cotton. And please, if you can't find it, just drop me an email. But it's a massive study.
And another question, the second question is coming from Matt Lambert in regards to Anders Ruwald's work in Detroit.
Yes.
You mentioned that the current circumstances change or add meaning. I'm wondering how conscious this project is as a white Danish sees hat maker, perpetuating a dialogue with policing for protection, which puts police as savior to the idea of Black deviation in the racially exploited and gentrifying city. Do you see COVID creating new meaning, or does it simply amplify the disparity between privileges and the ideas of access when addressing this work?
If I could be bad enough to say both, yes, it absolutely amplifies possibly some of the aspects of that work. At the same time, the fact that almost none of us can access it now, and it really is a place to be in rather than a thing to look at, even though it is beautifully photographed. As I told you, the smell, the scent, the claustrophobia. What I must admit I was thinking about was the idea of entrapment, and you're not entrapped, but you're not given a map, and you're not told what you're about to experience, although I'm sure people read articles and talk, and the door is closed behind you and it is very dark. On that level, I also think that people probably, those who do experience it now, are very different people than they were a year ago. And I think that that's something else that we all, I mean, I don't need to encourage people to think that way. I think we all realize that our ideas of space and movement have radically changed. Some of the other things about police violence in the US and the location of that and the gentrification of Detroit, I think that's amplified now, and that's not necessarily the artist's intent, although I'm not sure he would struggle with or deny that. Always dangerous to speak on behalf of artists, though.
Maybe he's in the audience, I'm not sure. But the next one is a question comes from Josephine Steed. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. Thank you, Jessica, for a very thought-provoking lecture. I am interested to hear your thoughts on immersive technologies as AR and VR as a new medium for craft that can mimic the visceral experiences related to craft and craft practice.
I'm a Luddite. And actually Luddites weren't anti-technology, so I should that phrase is misused, and I should also stop misusing it. I think that there is potential. Yuka and I have a PhD colleague who is interested in video and even in immersive technologies as a way of trying to communicate blacksmithing. And I suppose it does have increased value now that other forms of connection and movement are going to continue to be a challenge. I can't say that it is my fascination, because I suppose I am obsessed with touching materials. And even as an exhibition goer or a museum goer, even when we know that 100 times out of 101 there isn't a tactile experience there, I suppose I still at least like to be close to them. So I'm probably not the right person to ask. I'm sure that there are potentials, and our colleague who is working with this is particularly interested in things like time and sound, what the blacksmith knows as he hits the anvil. And I was part of a fascinating seminar with a colleague from music, and they got really excited about what they could hear in the anvil as a moment when the metal had been struck in an awkward way. And I realized I couldn't hear any of it. I don't have an ear for anything. So all of those different competencies, I think, are fascinating to think about how we build on them. I myself will continue to want to touch things and not ever believe that can be quite taken over by something else, but we'll see. I'll try and remain more open-minded than I sound now.
I also would like to mention that there is also certain privilege of being on site, since in this surroundings at the moment, and there is something about calibrating when these objects travel, because the other multisensorial observations cannot be completed. Yeah. So sometimes we are sending using post for critical, like to conduct crits so that we can really see like what's really going on, to have this more physical experiences with the objects, because that's something that this Zoom format or digital communication cannot really communicate, is to really calibrate the weight, the tactile, the senses, the back and front, the 360-degree views. I also, maybe connected to this, I would like to ask you, Jessica, I have noticed in all your lectures, you might have little tendency to include printed textile as craft. Like, I would like to know, like,
what's my problem?
yes.
I was awful at printing textiles at RISD, so I suppose I've got a hang up. And those of you that know me know I never wear patterns, so this is where the terrible thing of taste comes into play. I can disclose that I'm working on the second edition of the textile reader at the moment, and the same comment has been made. Can we have something about printed textiles? We all have our tastes and our affinities, and I'm obsessed with weaving. It's small, and it does create blind spots. So point taken, Yuka.
Okay, so, and maybe I would also like to encourage the audience members to put questions.
I can see the questions about the time difference, and this is being recorded. We're not going to make it public, but if you write to us afterwards, we'll provide you with a recorded link, and you'll be able to access it. So if anyone had an accident with the time change, then
yes,
it will be available.
Could you repeat the name of the artist with the installation with shared walls immersed? That was the date, in the first one of the earliest slides of the installation in Detroit.
Yeah,
that is the work of Anders Ruvalds, right?
I will. I'll type it into the box.
Yes. It may be also, I'm also personally curious, where do you meet your artists? How do you find your artists? Because you are intentionally choosing non-Eurocentric artists.
For this lecture,
yes,
that was intentional. I find it more satisfying to research and write about practices that are under-acknowledged. Of course, Faith Ringgold, something like that's a total contradiction. Huge amount of work done on her, but not so much done on her textiles. And those of you may know, I also studied literature. So of course I have a fascination with somebody blocked from the publishing industry who then publishes on cloth. But it would be more typical that I don't, gosh, I mean, there's too much good writing that's out there about some of our more familiar examples. And so unless there's something really overlooked, I find it more satisfying to try to think about practices that are a little bit less known. And that was a premise of this original talk. How I meet artists, I think is chance, like everyone else. Sometimes people approach me. That usually doesn't work very well. Sometimes I bump into people. It's a whole combination of things. Some of these examples were students in the past where I had lectured and I followed their work afterwards. It's a whole variety of things. But I do think that there are so many practices that deserve much more attention than they get. And so I suppose I do try to invest my time in those types of projects rather than somebody who has so much written about them already.
Okay, so
I will type the name in at the end of this because of what I said before about my brain not working.
Okay, good. So we will just go on to take further questions. Can you position the work, like the building in Detroit, in the discourse objectivity of craft? What are the definitions of craft that we must employ when we consider the work of today?
Can you say the first part of it again?
Can you position the work, like the building in Detroit, in the discourse or objectivity of craft? What are the definitions of craft that we must employ when we consider the work of today?
So if I understand the question to be about how we would define contemporary craft today, I'm not sure that is the question, but I mean, I already stand accused of showing you something very broad. And I even hear myself often saying art along the way. Many of the people I showed you would not necessarily describe themselves as craft practitioners. Many are simply not interested in what that category is. The one thing that I hold on to is a primary attention to materials. Now, that doesn't mean the previous question about immersive technologies, and that doesn't mean that the final outcome necessarily is a conventional craft material, but that thinking through materials is a large portion of how decision-making occurs. That's where I cast the net around craft. And the final outcome might be a video or a poem or all sorts of things. But I think that that's where I differentiate it from slightly other different types of work. Although I stand accused also of probably trying to co-opt many other practices under the umbrella of let's get excited about this as craft, sometimes probably to the dismay of the artists that I'm borrowing from. But if there's a high attention to the physical qualities and that there is a type of logic and decision making occurring through that as a big portion of the practice, I call that craft.
You have also mentioned something about local and being global.
Yes.
Like also like think, it also goes to this maxim of think local, act global.
Yeah.
But maybe that might be employed as a value of the craft research, but I'm not sure. But how do you see your research activity will navigate in the next years? Where do you see as a social and cultural implications of today that will then form your research?
Yeah, I think it's a mess because I have in the past talked so much about my fascination with the textile traveling and its movement being, you know, something that is part of its beauty and something that then resonates with me. Now I see also all of the misunderstanding, the misreading that occurs through that. And increasingly, I think that there does need to be as much attention to trying to let ourselves be taught what things mean at a local level. I think this also comes from, for the first time in my life, not working in an Anglophone context. So with Yuka, I work alongside many colleagues who are using English as a second or third language. And the amount of movement that translation creates, even in a community that is fluent, has made me realize that all these ideas about, oh, things travel and isn't it wonderful? And well, it's also really confusing. It also means that meaning is lost and other meaning is picked up. I think that that's natural and exciting, but I think that I need to really pull back from some of those ideas that, yes, it moves, okay, that's fine, but I think I underestimated, and as it moves, just how much does it change? And how much do our questions, whether you've got a lot of familiarity with Detroit or you have never visited Gothenburg, or they set such different contexts for our understanding. And I think that that's important to remember those sorts of differences as well.
Thank you. And how is a welcome, put in a parenthesis, expanding post-colonial lens transforming our understanding and valuing of craft?
I think, so if the question is that post-colonial strategies are becoming a little bit more known about, and and that is influencing the way that we read things materially, and this is good, this is welcome. I think that part of it is a responsibility for understanding some of the very unpleasant histories that our materials rest on, many of them rest on. There have been other debates about the potential of the margin. The post-colonial can be about minor voices. Is craft also about minor voices and the power of the margin? I think I used to get excited about those things, and I'm increasingly skeptical. The margin's a really hard place to spend your whole career on. I think I'm a little more jaded to that excitement than I would have been a decade ago. But as I come from literary studies as well as textiles, if my very quick synopsis of the post-colonial is about the understanding of multiple voices and multiple perspectives, not only a male, white, Eurocentric perspective, and that they all come with very, very different lessons and experiences, many of which actively silenced, or as many feminists would say, not silenced, just never heard. Craft does share in that connection. But I wonder sometimes if craft also starts to hide in the margin as well, and isn't necessarily always good at being confident about what it can do, and sometimes wants to sort of retreat to that place where it can sort of not be challenged because it's in a more marginal position, rather than being a little bit more confident to say, but these are some remarkable things that it can do that aren't necessarily so active in other areas, and we could be a bit more confident about that. That's not a post-colonial agenda. That's just the margin debates are they're, for people working inside institutions, they're really, really hard ones to actually live with.
Yes, thank you. It's very also exciting discourse to start the hiding place.
Yeah.
Especially in the time of COVID, because I also feel like our majority, the place where we spend a lot of time is now the hiding place also. So there's some kind of investigation we can develop there. It might be one of the last questions that we can take due to the time limit. It's from a question from Rose Sinclair. How do textiles crafts that sit in margins become part of the wider discourse of what is craft and what it means to craft, or how does this move beyond the folk dialogue?
Rose has a piece that's in BBC iPlayer at the moment. That is certainly one huge way where craft moves away from the margin and into more. Mainstream is such a difficult word. I don't mean mainstream in the sense of popular. I mean it more in the sense of reaching a broader audience. Because one of the things that I think many of us would acknowledge about craft is that it has so much relevance to daily life. It's not obscure. It's not esoteric. It has such powerful ways to make daily life connections. And then it's an enormous contradiction that it is appreciated and studied and celebrated by really a relatively small community of educators and students and researchers, when, unlike other topics, its influence and its appearance is actually maybe far more widespread than other disciplines. So I don't mean we should chase after the mainstream to somehow be generic and popular, but I do think that any types of opportunities that we can be brave enough to come forward and into that reach a bigger audience mean that these conversations don't just make academic circulation. There aren't enough of us. It's not, and so much of what we do is relevant far, far beyond the university or the academy. We know that, but it can be hard to open some of those doors. I think it might be getting a little bit easier. But then we also have to be very brave, because big audiences are scary. You know, it's more comfortable to speak to a small audience, or to speak to people that you already know are supportive of your ideas. To take that step into the unknown means you also will face less support. And I suppose that's where the teaching exercise comes in as well, the education exercise.
Yes. And also, I would like to then add another question here. Can you comment on skilled and non-skilled, the emergence of the amateur, etc., from your view?
We've got 1 minute left.
1 more minute. So last question.
I'm going to contradict myself here in the very last question. So this lecture was about sort of holding open a very big definition of craft that maybe included the curio and tourist art and Anthony Bumhira's two names. I sign with 2 names. I was offering that up as an economic warning and reality. And a sort of a function that I think we all need to take practically. But I don't know what to. The reality is that those definitions involve less skill. One of the things he was alluding to was allowing himself to make quickly and to make slowly. So those objects that I showed you the images of, ironically, the images that I had access to are his making slowly. Making slowly requires an investment of time. I think that although I opened up that big definition of craft, I did it to try and signal an economic message about recognizing the variety we have in the world. Within the context that I work with on a more regular basis, I think that craft is doomed if it lets go of skill. I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's cute. I don't think it's clever. I'm not a big fan of sloppy craft. Yuka asked me before about sort of a definition of contemporary craft. I was sort of very focused on materials. I personally also think that skill has to be part of that. I do think it's something else when skill becomes a joke. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. So I think that there's sort of the economic warning of the conversation that I was trying to show to you. In places where that choice can be made, it's a very different decision when people have skill and choose not to deploy it. They have acquired it and then for different reasons don't always use it. But I would say we still at least have to get to the point of being able to make that choice by acquiring the skill and then setting it aside.
Thank you very much. That was a really good ending remark. And I would like to also thank you everyone for this numerous participations as an audience. And I regret that we cannot look at the faces of the audience altogether because we are following the webinar format. Thank you very much, Jessica. And we did record this session. So if anyone is interested or you have missed the part of the lecture, please do contact
you can contact me
through Jessica's website.
Yeah.
And I'm also going to save the chat to make it visible. So thank you very much. And I hope you will stay healthy. And the next session is going to be in March, on March 10th, the open lecture, where we are going to have 2 artists from jewelry art to speak about the wonderful project that relates to the current pandemic called Hand Metal Project. So please keep your eye on our announcement for what's happening at the HDK-Valand. Thank you very much. Bye. I will wait a bit more. I will stop
Yeah.
recording.